The air in the high country had a bite to it, a clean, sharp cold that promised a clear dawn. Jed Harris felt it on his skin as he rolled out of his bedroll, the coarse wool a familiar comfort against the stiffness in his back. For a man who'd spent the better part of 30 years sleeping on hard ground, the earth still found new ways to work its way into his bones. He sat up, his movements slow and deliberate, a habit born from a life where a sudden move could startle a snake or spill the precious coffee grounds. The embers of last night's fire glowed a faint, pulsing orange in the pre-dawn gray. Jed reached for the kindling, his calloused fingers working with an economy of motion that was almost unconscious. Yesterday had been a good day, a rare day. He'd ridden into the Ute encampment with little more than a pouch of tobacco and a weary hope. He needed a new horse, his last one having given out with a broken leg in the unforgiving shale of the San Juan Mountains 2 weeks prior. Walking was a death sentence out here, and Jed had been walking for a long time. He'd expected to bargain, to trade, perhaps even to be turned away. What he hadn't expected was Chief Tohana. The man was old, his face a roadmap of seasons and sorrows, but his eyes were as clear and sharp as a hawk's. They'd shared smoke. Speaking little, Jed had stated his need. The chief had listened, his gaze unreadable. Then, he had led Jed to a pen where a gray gelding stood, head high, watching them with an intelligence that was almost unnerving. It was a magnificent animal, deep-chested and strong-limbed, with a coat that seemed to shimmer like river water in the low sun. A horse like that was worth $100 in any town, maybe more. $12, the chief had said, his voice a low rumble. Jed had stared, certain he'd misheard. He'd fumbled for the coins in his pouch, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. $12. It was all he had to his name. But for this horse, it was nothing. It was a gift. He'd handed over the worn silver dollars, the metal cold in the chief's warm, dry palm. The exchange had been sealed with a nod. No handshakes, no flowery words, just a transaction that felt too simple, too easy. As Jed had led the gray away, he'd felt the eyes of the entire village on his back. It wasn't a hostile feeling, but it was heavy. It was the feeling of being watched by people who knew something you didn't. He'd chalked it up to being an outsider, a white man in a world that had every reason to distrust his kind. He'd made camp a few miles out, the new horse tethered nearby, and had fallen into a deep, satisfied sleep, convinced his luck had finally turned. Now, coaxing the fire back to life. Jed's thoughts were on the trail ahead. With a mount like the gray, he could make it to Colorado before the first snows. He could find work, maybe on a ranch, and build his stake back up. The future, for the first time in a long while, felt like something more than just another day of survival. He set the battered coffee pot on the growing flames and stood, stretching the kinks from his spine. He turned to check on the gelding, and that's when he saw them. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight, as still and silent as the aspens that surrounded them. 2 young women, for a heartbeat. Jed thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that they were phantoms conjured by the lonely hours of the dawn. But they were real. The faint light caught the intricate beadwork on their deerskin dresses and the dark gleam of their long, braided hair. They carried small, tightly wrapped bundles, the kind a person packs when they don't expect to return. They weren't children, but they weren't far from it. The taller one, perhaps 18 or 19, stood with a straight-backed stillness that spoke of a deep, contained pride. Her face was composed, her dark eyes fixed on him, not with aggression, but with a startling intensity. It was a gaze that acknowledged him, measured him, and waited. The other was a year or 2 younger, her posture echoing her sister's, but with a subtle tremor of apprehension. Her eyes were wide, and they darted from Jed to the trees and back again, as if expecting a threat to emerge from the shadows. Silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. The crackle of the fire was suddenly an intrusion, The gentle nicker of the gray gelding sounded like a shout. Jed's hand, which had been halfway to his hip, froze. They weren't armed, not that he could see. They made no move toward him. They simply stood. Two silent figures who had appeared from nowhere, their presence an immediate and profound disruption of his solitary world. He cleared his throat. The sound rough. "Mornin'," he said, the word feeling clumsy and inadequate. They did not reply. The taller one gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The younger one just watched him, her knuckles white where she gripped her bundle. Jed's mind, slow to wake, was now racing. Who were they? Where had they come from? The Ute camp was miles back. They would have had to walk through the night, a dangerous journey in this wilderness. Why? His gaze shifted from the young women to the magnificent gray horse, and a cold knot of unease began to form in the pit of his stomach. $12. The price echoed in his mind, no longer sounding like a bargain, but like the opening line of a contract he hadn't read. He looked back at the chief's face in his memory, the stoic expression, the knowing eyes. He remembered the weight of the villagers' stares. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a consequence. He poured coffee into his tin cup, his hand steady despite the tremor of anxiety inside him. He needed to think. These weren't trail-worn women looking for a handout. There was a purpose in their stillness, a resolve in their expressions that went beyond simple need. The taller one's eyes held a deep sadness, but it was overlaid with a layer of tempered steel. The younger one's fear was plain, but beneath it was a matching determination. They weren't here to ask for anything. They were here to, what? To be received. The idea was absurd. It was preposterous. He'd bought a horse, a simple transaction. Men bought horses every day. It didn't come with attachments. It didn't come with people. But the longer he looked at them, standing so patiently in the morning chill, the more the feeling grew. He had been so focused on the prize, the horse, that he had failed to understand the nature of the deal. He had seen a cheap price. Chief Tohana had seen something else entirely. An investment, a transfer. He took a sip of the scalding coffee, the heat doing little to ward off the chill that was spreading through him now. He was a drifter, a man who moved with the seasons, unburdened by possessions or people. He liked it that way. His connections were fleeting, his responsibilities only to himself. It was a lonely life, but it was a simple one. The two silent figures at the edge of his camp represented the opposite of that life. They were a complication of the highest order, a responsibility he could feel settling on his shoulders like a physical weight. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story. He only knew that their arrival was intrinsically linked to the gray gelding and the 12 silver dollars he'd so eagerly paid. He had thought he was buying his freedom, a way to move faster and farther. Now, looking at the two solemn faces watching him across the clearing, Jed Harris had the sinking feeling that he had just bought himself a cage. The bargain of a lifetime had been struck, but he was only just beginning to understand his side of the deal, and he had a terrible, gut-wrenching certainty that the price was going to be much, much higher than $12. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, until Jed thought it might shatter. He drained his cup, the coffee now tasting like ash in his mouth. He set it down on a rock with a deliberate clink, the small sound echoing in the morning stillness. He walked a few paces toward them, stopping a respectful distance away. His eyes moved from the taller, stoic one to the younger, more nervous one, and back again. The question was a jagged stone in his throat. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was low, rough with the remnants of sleep and a growing apprehension. It was the taller one who answered. She took a half-step forward, a small movement that nonetheless felt momentous. Her gaze was as direct and unyielding as a drawn arrow. "We do not want anything," she said, her English clear and measured, with only the slightest trace of her native tongue. "My name is Siley. This is my sister, Emmy." She gestured with her chin toward the younger girl, who flinched slightly at the attention. "Our father, Chief Tohana," Sent us to go with you. It is part of the agreement." The words landed like punches. Jed stared at her, a slow, incredulous anger beginning to smolder in his gut. Agreement? He'd made no such agreement. He felt a flush of heat creep up his neck, the feeling of being made a fool. "The hell it is," he bit out, the words sharper than he intended. The agreement was for the horse, $12 for one gray gelding. That was the deal. Nothing more. He turned and paced back toward his fire, running a frustrated hand through his hair. He felt trapped, cornered by a bargain he had never made. He kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering into the brush. He spun back to face them, his voice rising with disbelief and fury. "I don't know what kind of game your father is playing, but I'm not a part of it. I bought a horse. Girl. A horse I don't take people. That's not what this was." The implication of the word hung in the air, ugly and vile. He was a hard man, but he was no trafficker. The very idea made his stomach turn. "You can turn right around and walk back to your camp. This has nothing to do with me." Sayali's expression didn't change. The steel in her eyes did not soften. If his anger affected her, she gave no sign. "He did not sell us," she said, her voice dropping, becoming more intense, more urgent. "This is not for sale. It is for survival." The word hung in the cold air, pushing back against his anger with its sheer, desperate weight. Survival. Jed's frustration faltered, replaced by a cold dread. This was more than a misunderstanding. This was trouble, deep and dark. Survival, from what he asked, his voice now a wary murmur. It was Emmy who whimpered, a small, terrified sound she tried to stifle. Sayali placed a reassuring hand on her sister's arm, never taking her eyes off Jed. "There is a man," Sayali said. "His name is Marcus Rigg." Jed knew the name, not personally, but by the dark whispers that followed it across the territories. Rigg was a man who collected land and power the way a vulture collects bones. He ran mining operations that poisoned rivers and bought off marshals with gold stripped from other men's claims. He was a sickness on the land, a man whose ambition was a fire that consumed everything in its path. He was known for his ruthlessness, for the brutal efficiency of the men he employed. "Rigg wants our land," Sally continued, her voice tight with a hatred that seemed too old for her young face. "The mountains have silver, and he means to have it. Our father has refused him. He has tried to fight him through the white man's laws, with papers and words. But Rigg does not respect paper. He respects only fear and force." She paused, taking a steadying breath. 3 nights ago, his men came to our camp. They did not come to talk. They came to send a message. They burned our winter stores. She faltered, her gaze dropping for the first time. "They hurt our people. They told our father he had 1 week to abandon our home, or they would return and burn everything, and everyone, to the ground." Jed listened, the story painting a grim, familiar picture. It was a tale as old as the first settlers, one he'd seen play out a dozen times in a dozen different places. Greed, power, and the crushing of anyone who stood in the way. "They are looking for us," Sayali said, her eyes lifting to meet his again, the fire of her purpose rekindled. "Rigg believes that if he holds the chief's daughters, he holds the tribe. He thinks he can force our father's hand. So we were sent away in the night. He is hunting us. Mr. Harris. Marcus Rigg has men whose only job is to find people who do not wish to be found, and when they find them, they are not kind." Jed felt like the ground had fallen out from under him. This was not a simple matter of escorting 2 girls back to their father. This was standing in the path of a man like Marcus Rigg. This was putting a target on his own back. His instinct, honed by years of solitary survival, screamed at him to get on the gray and ride fast and far and never look back. It wasn't his fight. He owed these people nothing. He had paid for his horse. He looked at Sayali's resolute face, then at Emmy, who was now trembling visibly, her eyes wide with a terror that was real and immediate. He looked at the horse, the magnificent animal that had been the bait in this elaborate trap. Chief Tohana hadn't sold him a horse for $12. He had hired a guard, a protector. He had gambled on the character of a man he'd met for all of 20 minutes. A bitter laugh almost escaped Jed's lips. The old chief had sorely overestimated him. "No," Jed said. The word coming out as a croak. He cleared his throat. "No, I can't. You don't know what you're asking. A man like Rig, going up against him is suicide. I'm one man. What do you expect me to do?" "We do not expect you to fight him," Sally said quickly, sensing his retreat. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them. Her voice was low, persuasive. "We are not asking you to be our savior. We are asking for time. Our father has sent word to the territorial authorities in Silver Creek, but the message is slow, and Rig has many friends. We need to reach the safe territory beyond the Red Canyon. It is a 3-day ride from here. 3 days. That is all we ask." She held up 3 fingers, her gaze boring into him, willing him to understand. "Help us for 3 days," she pleaded, the steel in her voice finally giving way to a raw vulnerability. "Get us to the Canyon Pass. After that, we will be among friends. You can take the horse and go your own way. We will part ways, and your obligation will be met. We will tell our father that the debt is paid." Jed stared at her, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. 3 days. It sounded so simple, yet it felt like a lifetime. 3 days of looking over his shoulder. 3 days of being hunted by Rig's men. Every shadow would hold a threat, every sound a potential enemy. It was a fool's bargain. The smart thing to do, the sane thing to do, was to refuse, as if reading his thoughts. Sayali played her final card. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, a chilling note of certainty in her tone. "If you ride away now and leave us here, Rig's men will find us before the sun is high. They follow our tracks from the camp, but they will not stop with us. They will see your tracks leading away. They will see the horse, the one that belongs to our tribe. They will assume you helped us escape. They will hunt you too. To them, you will be a loose end." She let that sink in before delivering the final, inescapable truth. "You can refuse," she said, her voice devoid of hope but full of grim reality. "But if you do, we may all die anyway. At least this way. We have a chance." The choice was laid bare before him, stark and ugly. It wasn't a choice between getting involved and staying free. His freedom had already been sold for $12. The choice was between running and facing a likely death, or staying and facing a possible one. He looked at the 2 young women, their lives now inexplicably tangled with his own. He looked at their small bundles, containing all they had left in the world, and he looked at the vast, indifferent wilderness around them, a place that could be a sanctuary or a tomb. His anger had evaporated, replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of inevitability. He was caught. The chief's gamble had paid off. Jed's world narrowed to the space between 2 heartbeats. Sedley's words echoed in the enclosed clearing. A verdict delivered in a courtroom made of pine and stone. His life, his solitary and fiercely guarded independence, had been wagered and lost by a man he barely knew. A deep, cold anger, colder and harder than the hot flash of a moment ago, settled in his bones. He was being maneuvered, corralled like a stray calf, his own history used against him as a brand. He opened his mouth to deliver a final, absolute refusal, to tell them that their father's desperate gamble was a losing one. But the word died on his lips. Something in Sayali's stance, the defiant tilt of her chin against a backdrop of sheer terror, struck a chord of memory deep within him. It was a dissonant, painful chord that resonated with a dull ache in his left side, just below the ribs. He closed his eyes for a second, and the crisp mountain morning dissolved. He was no longer in a camp with 2 desperate Ute women. He was somewhere else, 2 years in the past, under a relentless summer sun, the air thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and cheap whiskey. He'd been riding through a dry basin near Willow Creek, looking for nothing more than shade and a place to water his horse. What he found was a different kind of trouble. A small Navajo family, a man named Kla, his wife Anaba, and their young son had made a camp by the creek. They were quiet folk, bothering no one, but a trio of prospectors, their faces flushed with drink and the fever of failure, had decided the family was the source of all their problems. Jed had come upon the scene as it was turning ugly. The miners were shouting, their words slurred and venomous, shoving Kla back toward his lodge. Anaba stood protectively in front of her son, her face a mask of stoic fear. Jed wasn't a hero. He'd told himself that 1,000 times. A hero ended up dead or broke, and he'd been both more than once. The smart play was to keep riding. He'd seen it before, and he'd see it again. It was the way of things. But something about the boy's wide, dark eyes, fixed on the snarling faces of the miners, got under his skin. Something about the quiet dignity with which Kla stood his ground, unarmed against 3 bigger men, made Jed's hands tighten on his reins. He'd sighed, a weary, self-loathing sound, and swung down from his horse. The fight was a blur of clumsy, brutal motion. It was not the clean, decisive violence of a gunfight. It was ugly. Close-in work fists and boots and desperation. He'd managed to land a solid punch that sent the first man stumbling back, but the other 2 were on him at once. One swung a shovel, and Jed barely turned in time, the iron edge glancing off his ribs with a sickening crack. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in his side. He went down, the dry earth slamming into him. He remembered the miners standing over him, laughing, the sun in his eyes, the taste of blood in his mouth. He thought it was over, but then Kla was there, wielding a heavy branch from his firewood pile, and Anaba was screaming, a high, piercing cry that seemed to startle the drunken men out of their rage. In the confusion, Jed had managed to get to his feet, pulling the knife from his belt. The sight of the blade, and the blood now streaming down Jed's face, was enough. The prospectors, their courage soaked in whiskey and now rapidly evaporating, had backed away, muttering threats before stumbling off into the heat. He'd spent the next week in Kla's lodge, drifting in and out of a fevered haze. Anaba had tended his wounds with a skill that surpassed any town doctor's. She'd cleaned the gash on his head and bound his broken ribs, applying poultices of herbs that smelled of sage and damp earth. He remembered waking in the nights, the pain a constant, throbbing companion, and seeing the boy watching him from the shadows, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. When he was finally able to ride, he'd tried to thank them, but Kla had simply placed a hand on his shoulder. A good man's heart does not need thanks. He'd said. Jed had ridden away with a permanent ache in his side and a renewed conviction that getting involved was a fool's errand. The price was always too high. The memory receded, leaving him back in the cold dawn, the phantom pain in his ribs a stark reminder. He opened his eyes and looked at Siley. The world snapped back into sharp, unforgiving focus. How, Jed asked, his voice barely a whisper. How could you possibly know about that? Siley's expression softened with a hint of sorrow, an acknowledgement of the painful memory she had summoned. The story of the lone rider at Willow Creek traveled far, she said quietly. Kla is a distant cousin to our clan. He spoke of you. He said a white man with a quiet spirit and hard hands stood for his family when no one else would. He said you asked for nothing and left with wounds that should have killed you. This story reached my father's ears. She took a breath, letting the weight of her words settle. When Marcus Riggs' shadow fell over us, my father grew desperate. He did not know what to do. His appeals to the law were ignored. His warriors were too few to fight Riggs' men. He remembered the story. He asked the spirits for a sign, for a path, and then word came from our hunters. A lone rider, matching the description of the man from Willow Creek, was heading into our territory, alone, on foot. Jed felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a plan. A desperate, insane, shot-in-the-dark plan. He sent his best horse to be pastured where you would have to pass, Sally confirmed. Seeing the stunned realization on Jed's face, he instructed the guards to offer it for a price you could not refuse, a price that would seem like a miracle. He gambled. Mr. Harris. He gambled the last thing he had, not the horse, but the story of you. He bet our lives on the hope that the man from Willow Creek was still inside you, that he was the one man who could not, simply ride away when he saw people in need. Jed stared at her, then at Emmy, who was watching him with a fragile, pleading hope that was more potent than any threat. He felt a wave of bitterness. He had been profiled, judged, and sentenced to this duty based on one single, impulsive act from 2 years ago, an act he had regretted every painful step of the way since. So it was a trap, he said flatly, a well-laid trap. It was a prayer, Sally corrected him, her voice firm. It was my father's last prayer. He did not trap you, he trusted you. The distinction felt meaningless. Trap or prayer. The result was the same. He was here, with 2 lives in his hands and a pack of hired guns on his trail. It was too much. The coincidence was too perfect, too clean. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke, forcing him to confront the very part of himself he had tried so hard to bury. He wanted to rage against the unfairness of it, to curse the old chief and his desperate schemes. But then he looked into Sally's eyes. He didn't see the cunning of a manipulator. He saw the fierce, unwavering resolve of a daughter trying to honor her father's faith. He saw the reflection of Anaba standing defiantly before her child. He looked at Emmy, and in her terrified gaze, he saw the boy from Willow Creek, watching him, waiting for him to do something. This wasn't a choice. He saw that now. A choice implies a freedom he no longer had. The moment he'd helped Claw's family, he had forged a link in a chain, and that chain had now led directly to this cold, mountain clearing. To refuse would be to break that chain, to declare that the man who fought at Willow Creek was dead. And as much as he hated to admit it, as much as he feared the consequences, he knew that man was not dead. He was just weary. A profound, soul-deep exhaustion washed over him. He felt every mile he had ever traveled, every cold night he had ever spent alone. He was tired of running, tired of being a ghost on the landscape. This situation felt different. It felt like a reckoning. It was not a simple choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between who he was and who he wanted to be. He let out a long, slow breath, the white plume of it dissolving in the air like a surrendered ghost. The internal battle was over. There had been no victory, only a quiet, grim acceptance. This was his path now. Fate, or a chief's desperate prayer, had put him on it. He turned away from them, his movements stiff. He walked to his saddlebags and pulled out a small sack of hardtack and a strip of dried jerky. He tossed them to Sally, who caught them with a surprised look. "Eat," he commanded, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Both of you. We don't have much, but it's better than nothing." He turned to the gray gelding, which had been watching the entire exchange with its calm, intelligent eyes. He began to check the cinch on the saddle, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Sayeli clutched the meager food to her chest, her eyes wide. "Does this mean—" she began, her voice trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Jed didn't look at her. He kept his focus on the saddle, on the simple, tangible task in front of him. He pulled the leather strap tight. "It means we're burning daylight," he said gruffly, "and we have a 3-day ride ahead of us." There was no ceremony to the departure. The moment Jed's decision was made, a switch was flipped. The camp, which had been a small bubble of indecision and tension, became a place of grim, silent purpose. Jed moved with an efficiency that bordered on fury, kicking dirt over the last of the fire's embers, hissing at the plume of smoke as if it were a personal betrayal. He rolled his bedroll with 3 swift, violent motions and tied it to the back of the saddle. Every action was sharp, precise, and freighted with a new, terrible weight. He gave his orders without looking at the sisters, his voice a low, gravelly command. The horse is for you two. The younger one rides behind. Hold on tight. We stay off the ridgelines and out of the open valleys. We move through the trees. If I tell you to get down, you get down and you don't make a sound. You understand." Sayali met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. Her face was a mask of composure, but Jed could see the flicker of profound relief in her eyes, a relief so deep it was almost painful to look at. She turned to Emmy, murmuring something in their native tongue. The younger sister, her face pale and streaked with silent tears, looked from Sayali to Jed and nodded as well, her movements small and bird-like. Jed helped Emmy onto the gray's back, his touch impersonal and brief. Sayali swung up behind her, settling onto the horse's powerful haunches with a practiced ease. She wrapped her arms around her sister's waist, creating a small, self-contained unit of mutual support. They looked down at Jed, their dark eyes full of questions he had no intention of answering. He just grunted, took the gelding's reins, and started walking, leading them away from the dying fire and into the deep, unforgiving wilderness. The journey was a brutal, relentless climb. Jed set a punishing pace, abandoning the game trails for the path of most resistance, a path he hoped would be harder to track. They fought their way through thickets of manzanita, its wiry branches scratching at their clothes and skin like desperate claws. They scrambled over fields of scree, where loose shale shifted and slid underfoot, sending small rock slides whispering down the mountainside behind them. Each dislodged stone was a potential announcement of their presence, and Jed flinched at every sound, his senses stretched to a painful, vibrating tautness. He was acutely aware of the horse behind him, its steady breathing, the creak of the saddle leather, the soft clink of the bit. The animal was a miracle of sure-footedness, navigating the treacherous terrain with an intelligence that Jed had to admire, but it was also a liability. It was large. It left a clear trail, and it was the prize that had started this whole mess. For hours, the only sounds were their own labored breathing, the scrape of boots on rock, and the sigh of the wind through the high pines. The sun climbed, but its warmth was stolen by the elevation and the dense canopy. This was a world of shadows and sharp, angled light, a place where a man could disappear, or be made to disappear. Around midday, Jed found a small, defensible alcove where a trickle of snowmelt seeped from a rock face, offering them a place to water the horse and catch their breath. He stood guard while the sisters drank, his eyes constantly scanning the trees, his hand never far from the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered on his hip. Emmy, her face etched with exhaustion and fear, finally spoke, her voice a fragile whisper that was nearly lost in the vast silence. "They will not give up." Jed glanced at her. "Who?" "The men who follow us," she said, her eyes wide and haunted. "The ones who work for Marcus Rigg. They are not like other men. They are paid to find people. It is all they do." Sayali, who had been listening, added her own grim confirmation. "She speaks the truth. They are called the Collectors, though not to their faces. They are mostly former soldiers, men who found they had a taste for the hunt that did not end when the wars did. Rigg pays them more than any government ever could. Once they have your scent, they do not stop. Not for weather, not for mountains, not until they have been paid, and they are only paid when the job is finished." Jed's jaw tightened. He'd known, of course, that Rigg would hire professionals, but hearing it laid out so plainly by these young women, who had seen the men's work firsthand, gave the threat a new, more terrifying shape. This wasn't a posse of drunken miners. This was a team of relentless, skilled predators. His 3-day timeline suddenly felt wildly, suicidally optimistic. "They will not be kind when they find us," Emmy whispered, her voice cracking. Sayali put a protective arm around her. "We keep moving," Jed said, his voice hard. There was no room for comfort or false hope. There was only the trail ahead and the enemy behind. "Get back on the horse." They pushed on, the terrain growing steeper, more hostile. The air thinned, and every breath was a conscious effort. Jed's muscles burned, and the old ache in his side from the fight at Willow Creek flared into a stabbing pain, a constant reminder of the price of his own foolish principles. He ignored it, channeling the pain into a cold, focused anger that kept him moving, kept him alert. He was no longer just a drifter. He was a shepherd, and the wolves were closing in. He began to see the signs in the late afternoon. They were subtle, things a less experienced man would have missed. A single, fresh hoofprint in a patch of soft earth just off their trail, too clean and sharp to be from a wild animal. A raven circling high overhead, its cry sounding less like a call and more like an alarm. Then, the most unnerving sign of all the silence. The normal chatter of squirrels and jays had ceased. The forest was holding its breath, listening, waiting. Jed's skin crawled. He didn't need to see them to know they were there, somewhere in the trees, watching, pacing them, enjoying the chase. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange through the western sky, they descended into a narrow ravine, a stream, clear and cold, rushed over a bed of smooth, gray stones at the bottom. The sound of the water was a welcome relief from the oppressive silence. But Jed knew it was a dangerous place. Crossing the stream would leave them exposed, silhouetted against the failing light. "We cross here, and fast," he said, his voice a low growl. "Don't stop for anything." He took the reins and led the gray into the shallow, swift-moving water. The horse splashed forward, its shod hooves clattering on the slick rocks. Jed's eyes were fixed on the opposite bank, planning their path up and into the safety of the trees. They were halfway across when a flicker of movement on the high ridge to their left caught his eye. He froze mid-stride, the cold water swirling around his boots. He slowly, deliberately, lifted his gaze. There, standing against the fiery canvas of the sunset, was the silhouette of a man. He was perfectly still, a statue of patient menace. He held a long rifle, its barrel resting in the crook of his arm. He wasn't aiming it. He wasn't hiding. He was simply watching them, a silent spectator to their desperate flight. He was too far away to make out his features, but Jed didn't need to. He could feel the man's cold, professional gaze even from this distance. It was not the stare of an enemy preparing to attack. It was the calm, confident gaze of a hunter who has his prey cornered and is in no particular hurry to make the kill. It was a message, sent as clearly as if he had shouted it across the ravine. "We see you. We are here. There is no escape." A cold wave, far colder than the mountain stream, washed over Jed. The hope that they might have slipped away, that they might have a chance, evaporated in an instant. The chase was over. The game of hide-and-seek had ended. Sally let out a small, choked gasp from behind him. Emmy buried her face in her sister's back, her small body racked with a silent sob. Jed didn't move. He just stared up at the dark figure on the ridge, a grim acceptance settling over him. The collectors had found them. They were here. For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, Jed remained frozen in the stream, the icy water a numbing irrelevance. The figure on the ridge was a monument to their failure, a dark promise of the violence to come. Panic was a wild animal clawing at the inside of his chest, but he wrestled it down, choking it with a cold, hard pragmatism born of a lifetime of survival. Running blindly was what they wanted. It would make the final moments of the hunt easy. He would not give them that satisfaction. "Sally," he said, his voice a low, urgent command that cut through the sisters' fear. "Get the horse up the other side, into the trees, now!" His voice, calm and devoid of panic, was an anchor. Sally's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide, but she nodded. She kicked the gray gelding sides, and the powerful horse lunged forward, churning through the water and scrambling up the muddy bank. Jed followed right behind, his Colt now in his hand, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. The man was gone. The sudden emptiness where he had stood was almost more menacing than his presence had been. "Did he?" Emmy began, her voice a trembling whisper. "He's not alone." Jed cut her off. His words clipped. "He was the scout. The signal. They're closing in. They'll expect us to keep running uphill, deeper into the mountains. We're not going to—" He scanned their surroundings with a desperate, calculating eye. The ravine they were in was a death trap. But what lay beyond it, he remembered seeing it on their descent, a series of jagged rock formations, a maze of stone and shadow. Somewhere in there had to be a place. Not to hide, it was too late for that, but a place to make a stand. A place where the odds, however long, could be shortened. He grabbed the horse's reins. "This way. Stay close and stay quiet." He led them not up, but sideways, following the line of the stream as it curved around a massive buttress of granite. The ground was treacherous, a jumble of fallen rocks and tangled roots. For 20 minutes, he pushed them onward, the silence stretching their nerves to the breaking point. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like the cocking of a rifle. Then he saw it. It was barely an opening, a dark slash in the rock face, partially obscured by a cluster of hardy, wind-stunted junipers. A fissure, a narrow canyon no more than 10 feet wide at its mouth, with sheer rock walls that rose 100 feet on either side. It was a place the earth itself had broken open. "In there," he ordered. He led the horse inside. The canyon twisted sharply after 20 yards, cutting off the entrance from view. It continued for another 50 yards before ending in a solid wall of rock, a dead end, a box canyon, a perfect trap, or a perfect fortress. It all depended on who was on the inside. Jed tethered the horse in the deepest part of the canyon, where it would be shielded from any direct line of fire. The light was already failing, the high walls casting the space into a deep, premature twilight. He turned to the sisters. Their faces were pale in the gloom, their eyes fixed on him, waiting. The time for running was over. "All right," he said, his voice low and steady, absorbing the fear in the air and giving back only resolve. "This is where we stop. This is where we fight." He looked from one to the other, his gaze hard. "I need to know. Can either of you use a gun?" Sayali didn't hesitate. "Our father taught us. We are not warriors, but we know how to shoot. We can hit what we aim at." "Good." Jed felt a sliver of relief. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had a minute ago. He unstrapped the Winchester rifle from his saddle. It felt solid and comforting in his hands. He worked the lever, checking the action. He had the rifle, his Colt, and about 40 rounds between them. Not nearly enough. He looked at the small pistol tucked into the waistband of Sayali's dress, a weapon he hadn't noticed before. It was a small-caliber revolver. Better than nothing. "You," he said, nodding to Sayali. "You take the entrance. That first bend in the rock gives you cover. Nothing gets past that corner without you seeing it first. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Don't fire just because you hear something. Ammunition is all we have. We don't waste it." She nodded, her expression grimly determined. She checked her own weapon, her hands surprisingly steady. He turned to Emmy, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes. He softened his tone. "Just a fraction. Emmy, you're our second pair of eyes. I want you up there." He pointed to a wide ledge about 15 feet up the canyon wall, accessible by a natural chimney of cracked rock. "From there, you can see over the entrance bend. You can warn us if they try to climb the walls. You'll have my Colt. It's heavy, but it's accurate. Like your sister said, don't shoot unless you have to. Your main job is to watch." The girl swallowed hard, but nodded, a spark of her sister's resolve appearing in her eyes. Handing over his own sidearm felt like giving away a part of himself, but he knew it was the right play. 3 guns were better than 1. "What will you do?" Sayali asked. "I'm going to make things difficult for them," Jed replied with a grim smile. For the next hour, as the last of the light bled from the sky, Jed worked with a frantic, focused energy. He was no longer a hunted man. He was an architect of defense. He had Saeli and Emmy gather loose rocks, piling them chest-high at the bend, reinforcing Saeli's position. He took his lariat and, with some effort, managed to loop it over a precariously balanced rock formation high above the canyon entrance. He anchored the other end to a juniper root near the ground, creating a crude but effective deadfall. It wouldn't stop an army, but it would make the first man through the door regret his choice. He laid out their meager supplies, the remaining ammunition, a canteen of water, the last of the jerky. He checked his Winchester one last time. Everything was in its place. All that was left was the waiting. Night fell, absolute and smothering. The moon was a sliver, offering no comfort. The stars, usually so bright in the high country, seemed distant and cold. The canyon became a pocket of profound darkness, and every sound was amplified. The gentle stamp of the horse's hoof, the scuff of a boot on rock, the sound of their own breathing. Jed took up his position near Saeli, his back against the cold stone, the rifle across his lap. They sat in silence, a small island of defiance in a vast ocean of hostile wilderness. Hours passed. The cold deepened, seeping into their bones. Jed's senses were on fire, every nerve ending tingling. He listened to the night, trying to parse its language. The cry of a distant coyote, the whisper of the wind over the canyon rim. Was that a footstep, the snap of a twig, or just his own frayed nerves playing tricks on him? Then, a new sound. A voice. It came from the direction of the entrance, soft and unnervingly pleasant. It wasn't a shout. It was conversational, as if its owner were merely inquiring about the time. Jedediah Harris. The sound of his full name sent a jolt through him. They knew who he was. This wasn't random. It was personal. No need for all this unpleasantness. Mr. Harris, my employer, Mr. Rigg, has no quarrel with you. In fact, he's impressed. You've given my men quite the run. The voice was smooth, cultured, completely out of place in the rugged darkness. It was the voice of a man who was utterly confident, utterly in control. Jed remained silent, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "We know you're in there," the voice continued, its friendly tone curdling with menace. "And we know you have the girls. Let's be reasonable. Our business is with them, not you. Just send them out. You can keep the horse, a fine animal. Consider it a bonus for your trouble. You can ride out of here, and we will never speak of this again. You'll be a free man." Jed felt Saeli tense beside him. He could hear Emmy's sharp intake of breath from the ledge above. The offer was a serpent, sliding into their fortress of stone, whispering of betrayal and self-preservation. It was a test, the final test of the man from Willow Creek. Jed thought of the price of freedom. He thought of Claw's family. He thought of the two young women who had placed their lives in his hands, whose father had trusted him on the strength of a half-forgotten story. He thought of the $12. He raised his head, his own voice coming out as a low, steady growl that echoed off the narrow walls, carrying a finality as cold and hard as the rock around them. "Not a chance in hell." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The friendly pretense was over. The negotiation had failed. Then came the reply. Not a voice, but a flash of orange light from the canyon entrance, followed an instant later by the deafening crack of a rifle shot. The bullet shrieked through the air, striking the rock wall just inches from Jed's head, showering his face with stinging stone chips. The battle had begun. The world exploded into a maelstrom of sound and violence. Jed reacted purely on instinct, throwing himself sideways as the bullet struck the wall. He landed hard on his shoulder, the impact jarring his teeth. Another shot ripped through the darkness. Then a third, the muzzle flashes illuminating the canyon entrance in brief, violent strobes. The collectors were firing blind, probing the darkness, trying to draw a response. "Stay down," Jed yelled, his voice raw. "Don't fire, not yet." He crawled behind the rock barricade next to Saeli, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel her trembling beside him. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "How many?" "Couldn't tell. At least 3 guns firing. Maybe more." They waited, the echoes of the shots fading, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. Jed risked a peek around the edge of their cover. Nothing but impenetrable blackness. They were being patient, letting the fear work on them. "They'll try to rush the entrance," he whispered, his mouth close to her ear. "That's when you shoot. Don't aim for the flashes. Aim for the space right behind them." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was a weapon, designed to fray their nerves, to make them imagine a dozen men creeping forward in the dark. Jed knew the tactic. He forced himself to breathe, slow and deep. Suddenly, from the ledge above, Emmy's voice came in a panicked hiss. "I see them 2 men crawling toward the opening." "That was the signal. Now," Saeli Jed commanded. Saeli rose slightly, resting her small revolver on the rock wall. She fired. The small gun's crack was sharp, almost thin compared to the rifles, but it was followed by a satisfying grunt of pain and a flurry of curses from the darkness. A moment later, a figure broke from the shadows, charging toward them, firing his rifle from the hip. Jed was ready. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, found the dark shape in his sights, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against him, the boom of the shot deafening in the enclosed space. The charging man stumbled, cried out, and fell. Before Jed could feel a sliver of triumph, a searing, white-hot pain tore through his left shoulder. He cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound, as another shot from a different angle slammed into him. The impact spun him around, and he collapsed against the canyon wall, the Winchester clattering from his numb fingers. Jed Saeli screamed. The world was a dizzying, pain-filled haze. He looked down and saw a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. He tried to move his left arm, but it was useless. A dead weight filled with fire. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard more shots and the sickening thud of bullets hitting the rock around them. They were being pinned down. He gritted his teeth, the taste of copper in his mouth. "The rope," he gasped, forcing the words out. "The deadfall cut the rope." Saeli understood immediately. While the unseen rifleman kept firing, she pulled a small skinning knife from her belt and scrambled toward the juniper root where the lariat was tied. A bullet whined past her head, but she didn't flinch. She sawed at the thick rope with frantic energy. With a final, sharp pull, the rope snapped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a low groaning sound came from high above, followed by a tremendous crash as tons of rock and debris rained down on the canyon entrance. A choked scream was cut short, and the shooting stopped abruptly. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of shock, of a plan gone wrong. Jed had bought them a few precious moments. He used them to assess his own ruin. The shoulder wound was bad, bleeding freely. He pushed himself up with his good arm, his vision swimming. As he did, a new, sharper pain flared in his right hip. He looked down and saw another dark patch spreading on his trousers. He hadn't even felt the second hit in the chaos. "They're coming over the top!" Emmy shrieked from her perch. Jed looked up. A dark shape was rappelling down the sheer cliff face opposite them, moving with a terrifying speed and confidence. Their trap at the entrance had only forced the enemy to change tactics. "The back wall?" Jed rasped, pointing with his chin toward the end of the canyon. "There's a fissure, a chimney. I saw it when we came in. You have to climb. Go now." "We are not leaving you," Saeli cried, her face a pale oval in the gloom. "That's an order," Jed roared, the effort sending a fresh wave of agony through him. He fumbled for the fallen Winchester, managing to scoop it up with his good hand. "I'll hold them off. It's your only chance. Now go." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the terrible choice. But Emmy was already scrambling down from her ledge. pulling at her sister's arm. "Siley, we must." Siley gave Jed one last, anguished look, then turned and pushed her sister toward the back of the canyon. Jed leaned his wounded body against the rock wall for support, chambered a new round into the rifle with a clumsy, one-handed motion, and aimed toward the descending man. He fired, the recoil nearly knocking him over. The shot went wide, but it served its purpose, forcing the man to swing sideways and seek cover. Jed fired again, the rhythmic working of the lever and the squeezing of the trigger becoming a desperate prayer for time. He was bleeding, growing weaker by the second, but every shot he fired was another few seconds for the sisters to climb. He heard the scrape of their boots on the rock behind him, the small grunts of effort as they began their ascent. Suddenly, a new figure appeared, not from the top, but from the side, melting out of a deep shadow near the canyon bend that Jed hadn't even registered as a hiding place. This man moved differently. He was silent, fluid, carrying no rifle. In the faint starlight, Jed could see the glint of a long knife in his hand. This was not one of the riflemen. This was a predator. "Jedediah Harris," the man said, his voice the same calm, cultured tone they had heard earlier. He took a step closer. "My name is Thorne, Mr. Riggs sends his regards. He prefers a tidy accounting." Jed tried to bring the rifle to bear, but the man was too fast. He closed the distance in 2 silent strides, his foot kicking out and sending the Winchester flying from Jed's grasp. Jed staggered back, pulling the Bowie knife from his own belt. His vision was starting to blur at the edges. His wounded hip screamed in protest, and his left arm hung uselessly. Thorne smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "A wounded animal is always the most dangerous," he mused. "This should be interesting." He lunged. Jed, clumsy and off balance, barely managed to parry the strike, the blades ringing together with a sharp, metallic clang. Thorne was a whirlwind of controlled motion, his knife a blur in the darkness. He was faster, stronger, and unwounded. Jed was fighting a losing battle. He gave ground, his back hitting the cold, unforgiving rock wall. Thorne pressed his advantage, his knife slicing through the air, forcing Jed into a desperate, defensive dance. Jed's boot slipped on a loose stone. He stumbled, and Thorne was on him, the point of his blade seeking Jed's throat. Jed twisted, the knife scoring a burning line across his cheek. He slammed the pommel of his own knife into Thorne's wrist. The man grunted, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Jed shoved him back, creating a precious inch of space. He knew he couldn't win a straight fight. He was too hurt, too slow. He needed to end it now. As Thorne came at him again, blade low and ready to gut him, Jed did the last thing he expected. He dropped his own knife. Thorne's eyes widened in surprise at the clatter of steel on rock. That split second of confusion was all Jed needed. He lunged forward, not with a weapon, but with his body, his good shoulder slamming into Thorne's chest. He wrapped his right arm around the man's neck, ignoring the fire in his hip, and used the man's own momentum to drive them both backward, hard, against the sheer canyon wall. Thorne's head connected with the granite with a sickening crack. His body went limp, his knife falling from his nerveless fingers. Jed held him for a moment, his breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. Before letting the man slump to the ground, he was done. Leaning against the wall, gasping for air, Jed looked toward the back of the canyon. He could just make out Emmy's form disappearing over the top of the fissure, but Sayeli was still there, halfway up, looking down at him. "Go," he croaked, his voice a broken whisper. "Get out of here." But she was already climbing down. "You fool girl," he raged, his anger a thin mask for his terror for her. "I did this so you could get away." She reached the bottom and rushed to his side, ignoring his protests. She looped his good arm over her shoulder, taking his weight. "The man from Willow Creek did not run," she said, her voice fierce and shaking. "Neither does the daughter of Chief Tohana." Together, they staggered toward the fissure. From the canyon mouth, he could hear shouting. The other collectors had found a way past the rockfall. Their time was up. The climb was a nightmare. Every movement was a fresh agony for Jed. Sayali, strong and determined, pushed and pulled him upward, her quiet words of encouragement the only thing that kept him from surrendering to the encroaching darkness. He could feel the warm stickiness of his own blood, the weakness spreading through his limbs. They were almost at the top when the first shot from below rang out. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near his head. Emmy, now lying flat on the canyon rim above, fired back with a Colt, her shot surprisingly steady. With one last, desperate heave from Sayali, Jed cleared the edge. He collapsed onto the rocky ground, his body a symphony of pain. He rolled onto his back, looking up at the cold. Indifferent stars. They had made it. They were out. But as he lay there, listening to the shouts and curses echoing from the canyon they had just escaped, he knew this was not the end. It was just a pause. The hunt was far from over. Marcus Riggs' men were still coming. The escape from the canyon was no victory. It was merely a stay of execution. The world beyond the rim was a hostile, alien landscape of wind-scoured rock and skeletal trees. There was no trail, no sanctuary, only the vast, crushing indifference of the mountains. Jed's consciousness was a flickering candle flame, threatening to be extinguished at any moment by the howling wind of his pain. He was a dead weight, a liability that was slowing them down to a crawl. Sayali and Emmy, their face grim with determination, fashioned a crude sling for his useless left arm from a strip of Emmy's dress. They supported him between them, half dragging, half carrying him over the uneven ground. Every step sent a fresh wave of agony radiating from his shoulder and hip. The world swam in and out of focus, the sharp edges of the rocks blurring into a gray haze. He was leaving a trail of blood, a series of dark, glistening markers on the pale stone for their pursuers to follow. "Leave me," he slurred at one point, his tongue thick and clumsy in his mouth. "You'll move faster." "We do not leave our people behind," Sayali grunted, her own breath coming in ragged gasps as she adjusted her grip, taking more of his weight. "Our father trusted you. We will not dishonor that trust." Jed wanted to argue, to tell her that honor was a luxury for men who weren't bleeding out on a mountainside. But the effort was too much. He surrendered to their iron-willed resolve, his own fading with every drop of blood he lost. He became a passenger in his own body, dimly aware of the scrape of his boots, the strength of the arms supporting him, the whispered words of encouragement the sisters exchanged in their own language. They moved through the long, dark hours of the night, driven by the sounds of the pursuit that echoed from the canyon below. The shouts of the collectors, frustrated and angry, were a constant spur, a reminder that to stop was to die. Dawn found them high on a windswept pass, the air thin and bitingly cold. Before them, the mountains began to give way to a wide, open valley, dotted with the promise of settlements and safety. The Red Canyon Pass. Freedom. It was so close he could taste it, a phantom flavor of clean water and rest on his dry, cracked lips. But the hope was a mirage. Standing at the mouth of the pass, blocking their path, were 4 riders. They were not the rough, trail-worn collectors from the night before. These men sat on fine horses, their clothes clean, their rifles held with a casual, confident authority. And at their head, on a magnificent black stallion that seemed carved from shadow and fury, sat a man who could only be Marcus Rigg. He was not what Jed had expected. He was older, perhaps 50, with silvering hair at his temples. He was dressed in a fine, tailored coat, looking more like a banker from back east than a territorial tyrant. But there was a coldness in his pale blue eyes, a complete and utter lack of empathy that was more terrifying than any overt display of brutality. He watched them approach, a small, condescending smile playing on his lips. "Well, well," Riggs said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. It was a voice accustomed to command, smooth and edged with steel. The lost lambs and their wounded sheepdog. I must say, Harris, you have exceeded all expectations. My man Thorne was my very best. It is a considerable inconvenience to have lost him. Jed staggered to a halt, leaning heavily on the sisters. His vision cleared for a moment, sharpened by a final surge of adrenaline. He looked at the man who had been the source of all this terror, this pain. Riggs' gaze fell upon Jed, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He nudged his horse forward, stopping just a few yards away. The old chief played a clever hand. I'll grant him that. A desperate move, but a clever one. Tell me, what was the price for a man of your principles? He paused, his smile widening as if he already knew the answer. Ah, yes. My scouts in the village were very thorough. $12. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. $12 for a horse, he mused, looking Jed up and down with open contempt. And in return, you've inherited a blood debt that will cost you everything. I do hope you think it was a fair trade. The world tilted under Jed's feet. Despair, absolute and profound, washed over him, extinguishing the last embers of his fighting spirit. It was over. They had run, they had fought, and they had bled, only to end up here, at the feet of the man they could not escape. He was too weak to lift a gun, too broken to even stand on his own. He had failed. He slumped forward, his strength finally giving out. Sally and Emmy struggled to hold him up, their own faces masks of hopeless defiance. This was the end of the road. Then he felt a small, urgent pressure against his good hand. He looked down. Emmy, her face pale but her eyes blazing with an intensity he had never seen in her before, was pushing a small, oilskin-wrapped package into his palm. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with folded papers. She looked from the package to his face, her expression a silent, desperate plea. Look. With trembling fingers, his movements clumsy and slow, Jed fumbled with the ties. The oilskin fell away, revealing a sheaf of papers, tightly folded and bound with twine. He managed to work the twine loose. The first paper he unfolded was a ledger page, filled with a neat, precise script. It was a list of names, followed by dates and sums of money. At the top of the page, written in the same hand, were the words "Payments rendered." M. Rigg to Marshal Covington. His breath hitched. He unfolded another paper. It was a sworn affidavit, signed with the thumbprint of a homesteader named Elias Vance, detailing how Rigg's men had driven him from his land after he had refused to sell. It described threats, intimidation, and the burning of his crops. It was dated 2 years prior. He kept unfolding. There were more, a dozen more affidavits, each telling a similar story of coercion and violence. There was a hand-drawn map, meticulously detailed, showing the original claim lines of a dozen small ranches and homesteads, all of which were now part of Rigg's vast holdings. Another map detailed the location of an unsanctioned silver mine, operating with forced labor from men who had fallen into Rigg's debt. There were copies of letters, transcripts of conversations, a web of corruption and brutality laid bare on paper. It was a lifetime of malevolence, documented and preserved, a weapon more powerful than any gun. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The sheer, stunning audacity of Chief Tohana's plan, hitting Jed with the force of a physical blow. The chief had never intended for them to simply escape. This was never just about saving his daughters. This was a counterattack. He had spent years gathering this evidence, this proof of Rigg's crimes, creating a case so damning it could bring down his entire empire. But the evidence was useless in his own hands. He needed to get it to the territorial capital, to the federal judges who were beyond Rigg's influence. He couldn't send a warrior. He would be stopped and killed before he'd gone 10 miles. He needed a messenger no one would suspect, a ghost, an outsider, a lone white man, a drifter who had no apparent connection to the tribe, a man who, if he were caught, would seem to be nothing more than a common horse thief. The $12 horse wasn't bait for a bodyguard. It was the payment for a courier. Jed wasn't meant to be their savior. He was the delivery system. The entire desperate, bloody flight through the mountains had been a mission to transport this package. They hadn't been running from Rig. They had been running to the law, with the one thing that could finally stop him. Jed looked up from the papers, his eyes finding Marcus Riggs. The pain in his body was a distant thing now, overshadowed by the sudden, blazing clarity of his purpose. The despair was gone, burned away by a hope so fierce it was almost painful. Rig had seen the exchange. His condescending smile had vanished, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Then a dawning, ugly comprehension as he watched the expression on Jed's face. He knew, in that instant, that this was more than just a matter of two runaway girls. "Whatever trinkets the old man gave you, they are worthless," Riggs snarled, his voice losing its smooth veneer, revealing the viper beneath, just ashes and lies. But Jed knew better. He clutched the papers in his hand, the sharp edges pressing into his palm. This was not a blood debt he had inherited. It was a trust he had been given. He was no longer a wounded sheepdog. He was a messenger, carrying a verdict. And though he was half dead and surrounded, for the first time since this had all begun, he felt like he had a fighting chance. The air on the high pass grew thin and sharp, each breath a sliver of ice in the lungs. For a long moment, no one moved. The world had shrunk to the space between two men, one half dead and righteous, the other powerful and exposed. Jed's hand, slick with his own blood, tightened on the sheaf of papers. It was his only weapon, and his only shield. Marcus Riggs' pale eyes, which had held a flicker of uncertainty, now hardened into chips of glacial ice. The condescending smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, pragmatic fury. He had built his empire on the calculated application of fear, on secrets buried so deep they had become truth. The papers in Jed's hand were a shovel, threatening to unearth it all. The risk was unacceptable. The equation was simple. His gaze shifted from Jed to his men, and his voice was devoid of all previous civility. It was flat, cold, and absolute. Kill them. The command was so quiet, so devoid of passion, that it was more chilling than any shout. It was a business order. "Kill the man and the two girls," Rig elaborated, his eyes still locked on Jed. "Burn those papers until they are nothing but ash. Leave nothing here but rock and wind." The four riders, professionals to their core, reacted without hesitation. 4 rifles were raised, 4 hammers cocked with a sound like the breaking of bones. The black muzzles centered on Jed, Siley, and Emmy. This was it, the end of the line. There were no more canyons to hide in, no more desperate climbs to make. Jed felt a strange, hollow calm settle over him. He had delivered his message, even if only he and his murderer would ever know it. He met Riggs' gaze, a final, silent act of defiance. He felt Sayali's hand grip his arm, her knuckles pressing into his skin, a small, human anchor in the final seconds before the tide of violence washed them away. A sound. At first, it was just a low rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was the sound of approaching horses, too many to be Riggs' returning collectors. Riggs' men heard it too, their eyes flicking nervously toward the mouth of the valley from which the settlers were supposed to come. Riggs' face tightened with irritation. He had expected a clean, quiet resolution. This was an untidy complication. "Finish it," he snarled. But before his men could obey, the riders came into view. It was not a cavalry charge, not a disciplined posse. It was a motley collection of a dozen, perhaps 15, men. They were farmers on plow horses, prospectors on wiry mules, and ranchers on sturdy cow ponies. They were dressed in worn denim and dusty leather, carrying old Spencer carbines and double-barreled shotguns. They were the people of the free territories, and their faces were hard and determined. At their head rode a tall, broad-shouldered man with a full beard and steady eyes. He reined in his horse, his gaze taking in the scene with a swift, practiced assessment, the well-dressed man on the black stallion, his armed guards, and the blood-soaked trio they held at gunpoint. The man's eyes met Jed's, and a flicker of recognition, of shock, passed between them. Jed's weary mind dredged up the memory. Silas Croft, 4, maybe 5 months ago. A small homestead on the far side of the territory, a gang of claim jumpers had tried to burn him and his family out. Jed had been passing through, had seen the smoke. He'd spent an afternoon helping the family fend them off. A brief, violent skirmish that ended with the claim jumpers fleeing. He'd shared a meal with Croft and his wife, accepted their quiet, heartfelt thanks, and had been on his way by morning, the incident already fading from his mind. Just another Tuesday in a long line of them. He had never expected to see him again. Silas Croft dismounted, his shotgun held loosely but ready in the crook of his arm. The other settlers fanned out behind him. A silent, formidable line of ordinary men pushed to an extraordinary purpose. They said nothing, but their presence was a shout. "This is a private matter. Gentlemen," Riggs said, his voice regaining its smooth, authoritative tone, though a dangerous edge now lay beneath it. "I'd advise you to ride on." Silas took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Rigg, though his words were for Jed. "We heard shooting from the canyons. Sounded like a war. Came to see what the trouble was. Looks like we found it." He finally looked at Jed, at the blood covering him, at the exhausted but defiant young women at his side. "You all right, friend?" "He is trespassing," Rigg cut in, his horse shifting nervously. "These people are wanted for theft. They are fugitives from the law." "Your law, Mr.?" Rigg Silas asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Because the only law we recognize out here is the kind that protects a man's home and family. And right now, it looks to me like you and your men are the trespassers." A low murmur of agreement went through the assembled settlers. Their rifles, which had been pointing at the ground, began to lift. The standoff was now a powder keg, and Jed Harris held the match. A fire, born of purpose and a righteous fury, burned through the pain and exhaustion in Jed's body. This was his chance. This was the moment Chief Tohana's plan had been designed for. He had to stand. With a groan that was torn from the depths of his soul, he pushed himself upright. Sally and Emmy, sensing his intent, supported him, their slight frames straining under his weight. He was a gruesome sight, his shirt a tattered ruin of dried and fresh blood, his face pale and etched with pain. But he stood, and he raised his right hand, the hand that held the damning evidence. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout. It was a raw, ragged rasp. But it carried across the pass with the terrible weight of truth. "This man, Marcus Rigg, is a liar," Jed began, his voice gaining strength with every word. He shook the papers, the sound a dry rustle of judgment. "He talks about the law. I hold his laws in my hand. Here is the proof of the marshal he bought. Here is the name of the homesteader he had burned out of his valley. Men like you." He locked eyes with Silas, then with the other faces in the crowd. "This man is a murderer. He sent his assassins to kill a chief's family to steal their land. The man my friends and I killed in that canyon. His top man, Thorne, was just one of them." He took a shaking breath, leaning on the sisters, who were now looking at him with awe. "This man is a land thief. This map shows the claims he stole, the water rights he diverted, the ranches he bankrupted with fear and intimidation. He preys on the weak and calls it business." He held up the papers one last time, his voice rising to a raw cry of accusation that echoed off the high rock walls. "And he is the leader of a ring of traffickers. He runs a silver mine with the labor of men he's trapped in debt, men who are little more than slaves. This is your law. This is the man who claims to bring order. He brings only ruin and the grave." A heavy, dangerous silence fell over the pass. The settlers stared from the blood-soaked man making the accusations to the powerful man being accused. They had all heard the rumors, the dark whispers about Marcus Rigg. But here was the proof, held aloft in the hand of a dying man who had nothing left to lose. They looked at the hard faces of Rigg's men, then at the innocent faces of the two Ute women, and they made their choice. More hammers were cocked. The line of settlers took a collective step forward. Marcus Rigg was a man who understood numbers. He understood leverage and risk. He looked at the dozen rifles pointed his way, at the hard, unforgiving eyes behind them. He looked at the papers in Jed's hand. He could order his men to open fire. They might even kill Jed and the girls in the first volley, but they would be cut down immediately after. And the papers might survive. One of these homesteaders would pick them up. The story would be told. An open battle with the citizens of the territory was a war he could not win. His face became a blank mask. He had lost this hand. For now, he gathered his reins, his movements precise and controlled. "This changes nothing, Harris," he said, his voice a low, venomous promise. "A dead man can't testify." He turned his magnificent horse, gave a curt nod to his men, and without another word, rode away. His men, their faces a mixture of relief and frustration, followed him, leaving the pass in a sudden, profound silence. For a moment, everyone just stood, watching them go. Then, the tension that had held Jed together, the fire that had animated him, finally sputtered out. His knees buckled. The papers fluttered from his grasp. The world dissolved into a swirling gray vortex. He was caught before he hit the ground. Strong hands were holding him. Faces grim with concern swam above him. He had survived. They had all survived. But as the darkness claimed him, he was aware of a deep, abiding wound that had nothing to do with the bullets in his shoulder and hip. It was the wound of what he had seen, what he had done, and the terrible price of standing for what was right. The first thing to return was pain. It was not the sharp, screaming agony of the fight, but a dull, heavy, and comprehensive ache, a leaden blanket that covered him from head to toe. It was the pain of a body that had been broken and was now trying to knit itself back together. It was the pain of being alive. Slowly, other sensations filtered through the fog. The scent of pine wood and wood smoke mingled with the clean, slightly bitter aroma of sage and willow bark. The unfamiliar comfort of a soft mattress beneath him, a real mattress stuffed with straw and feathers, not the hard, unforgiving ground. A coarse but clean wool blanket was drawn up to his chin, light, hazy, and gentle, seeped through his eyelids. He forced them open. The world was a blur of wooden ceiling beams and shadow. He blinked, and the blur slowly resolved into focus. He was in a small, tidy cabin. A low fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. He tried to sit up, but a fresh, searing wave of pain from his shoulder and hip slammed him back down onto the mattress with a groan. "You should not move." The voice was quiet, calm, and familiar. He turned his head, the simple movement an act of supreme effort. Sayali was sitting in a simple wooden chair beside his bed. She was not wearing her worn deerskin dress, but a simple calico garment that someone must have given her. Her long, dark hair was unbraided, falling freely over her shoulders. In her hands was a bowl of steaming water and a clean cloth. There were dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes, but her expression was one of serene, watchful calm. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert. All that came out was a dry, rasping croak. She seemed to understand, setting the bowl aside and reaching for a tin cup of water on a small table. She gently lifted his head with one hand, holding the cup to his lips with the other. The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. He drank greedily, then fell back, exhausted by the effort. How long he managed to ask, his voice a rough whisper. 3 days, she answered, her voice soft. You have slept for 3 days. The doctor said the fever was the worst of it. It broke this morning. Doctor, bed, cabin. The words floated in his mind, disconnected from his reality of rock and blood and gunpowder. He looked at his own body. His chest and shoulder were tightly wrapped in clean white bandages. He could feel another thick dressing on his hip. He had been tended to, cared for, by skilled hands. Where? Silas Croft's homestead, she explained, anticipating his question. We are in the valley, beyond the pass. You are safe. Safe. The word felt foreign, a language he had long forgotten. He looked past her. Through the single window of the cabin, he could see other log structures, a curl of smoke from another chimney, the shape of a barn. He saw a group of children, their laughter a bright, clear sound that carried on the crisp air, and among them, her hair glinting in the autumn sun, was Emmy. She was running, chasing a ball made of bound rags, her face alight with a joy so pure and unburdened it made Jed's chest ache. She was a different person from the terrified, trembling girl in the mountains. She was a child again. He watched until the children's game moved them out of sight. The sight of Emmy's simple, profound happiness was a more potent medicine than any poultice. It was the proof, the reason, the thing he had bought with his pain. For the next few days, this became his world. The four walls of the cabin, the view from the window, and Sayali's quiet, constant presence. She rarely spoke unless he asked a question, but she was always there. She changed his bandages with a gentle, practiced efficiency, her touch light and professional. She fed him broth and a thin corn mush, patiently, as if he were a child. She would sit for hours while he slept, mending his torn clothes with a needle and thread. The rhythmic pull of her work a soothing, constant sound in the quiet room. In these long, silent hours, Jed found himself watching her. He noticed the way the firelight caught the deep auburn highlights in her dark hair. He saw the strength in her slender hands, hands that could tend a wound or fire a pistol with equal competence. He saw in her eyes not just the fierce resolve he'd witnessed in the mountains, but a deep well of compassion, of a gentleness she had kept hidden beneath layers of necessity. A fragile, unspoken connection began to form between them in that quiet, sunlit room. A bond forged not in words, but in shared trauma and the simple, profound act of care. On the fifth day, Silas Croft came to visit. He was a large, quiet man, his presence filling the small cabin. He stood by Jed's bed, turning his worn hat over and over in his big, calloused hands. "Heard you were awake," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Figured you'd want to know." Rig, Jed asked, the name tasting like poison. Silas allowed himself a grim smile. "Those papers of yours, they hit the territory like a lightning strike. We sent a rider straight to the federal marshal in the capital. Turns out, not every lawman was in Rig's pocket. The marshal issued a warrant for Rig's arrest within the hour. For murder, land fraud, everything you said." Jed felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. "Did they get him?" Silas shook his head. "He vanished, slipped the net, but his empire is crumbling. The men who worked for him, the ones who feared him, they don't fear him anymore. They fear the gallows. We've had a half dozen of his collectors turn themselves in, all of them trying to make a deal, all of them telling the same stories your papers told. They're hunting him now, not just the law, but his own men. There's a bounty on his head big enough to make a man rich for life. He's the one who's running now. He won't ever show his face in this territory again." The news was a balm, soothing the raw edges of Jed's memory. It was over, truly over. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived. Jed was dozing when he heard the soft murmur of voices outside the cabin door. He heard Sayali and Emmy speak in their native tongue, their voices filled with an emotion he had not heard before, a joyous, tearful relief. The cabin door opened, and the sisters entered, and with them was their father. Chief Tohana was older and more stooped than Jed remembered, the lines on his face carved deeper by worry, but his eyes were the same clear, sharp, and filled with an ancient wisdom. He ignored Jed completely at first, his entire being focused on his daughters. He opened his arms, and they went to him, all the stoicism and bravery melting away as they became his children once more. He held them, his eyes closed, his face a mask of profound, overwhelming love and gratitude. He murmured their names, his voice thick with emotion. After a long moment, he released them and turned his attention to the man in the bed. He walked slowly to Jed's side, his gaze taking in the bandages, the pale exhaustion on Jed's face. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Jed felt a flicker of the old resentment, the feeling of being a pawn in this man's desperate game. But then the chief spoke, and his voice was raw, stripped of all its authority, leaving only the sound of a father's humbled heart. "They told me what you did," he said, his voice thick and quiet. "How you fought, how you were wounded, how you stood for them when you could have walked away." He reached out and, with a startling gentleness, placed his warm, dry hand on Jed's good shoulder. "When I sent my daughters into the wilderness, I sent my heart with them. I had seen the darkness in Marcus Riggs' eyes. I knew the law of the white man would not protect us. I had nothing left." He paused, his throat working, his dark eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I had nothing left but a story about a stranger who helped another family, for no other reason than it was the right thing to do." He looked directly into Jed's eyes, and in their depths, Jed saw the crushing weight of the gamble the old chief had taken. "I had nothing left," Chief Tohana repeated, his voice a near whisper, choked with an emotion that transcended race and language. "Nothing but the belief that you were the one man who would not run." And with those words, the last of Jed's bitterness dissolved. He finally understood. It had not been a trap. It had been an act of faith, a desperate, impossible, and ultimately triumphant act of faith in the character of a man he had never even met. It was the greatest honor he had ever received. Weeks bled into a month. The sharp, vibrant colors of autumn mellowed into the muted browns and grays of late fall. Jed's body healed with the slow, stubborn patience of a tree mending its bark. The wounds in his shoulder and hip, which had once been gates to the edge of the next world, closed and became scars. They were tight, angry reminders of the price he had paid, but with each passing day, the pain lessened, becoming a dull, familiar ache rather than a blinding fire. He moved from the bed to the chair, and from the chair to the cabin's small porch. He spent hours there, wrapped in a thick blanket Siley had procured for him, watching the simple, rhythmic life of the settlement unfold. He watched Silas Croft and his sons mending a fence, their hammers ringing out in a steady, productive rhythm. He watched the women gathered around a communal fire, grinding corn and sharing stories, their laughter carrying on the wind. He watched Emmy, who had been adopted by the other children, her past trauma receding in the face of simple, uncomplicated acceptance. For the first time in his life, Jed Harris was stationary, and he found to his profound surprise that it did not feel like a cage. For years, he had defined himself by his movement, by his ability to leave, to never put down roots that could be torn up. To be a drifter was to be free, he had always told himself. But watching this small, resilient community, he began to understand a different kind of freedom. It was the freedom that came from belonging, from being a part of something larger than oneself. When he was strong enough to walk with the aid of a rough-hewn crutch, he began to take short, shuffling tours of the homestead. The settlers, who had at first treated him with a kind of awed reverence, began to treat him as one of their own. They were not effusive. They were practical, hard-working people. Their acceptance was not shown in words of praise, but in small, simple gestures. A nod from a man passing on his horse, an extra piece of cornbread left on his porch by Silas's wife, Mary, an offer to help him whittle a new, more comfortable handle for his crutch. He was no longer the man who faced Rigg. He was just Jed, and Jed, a man who had spent a lifetime holding the world at arm's length, found himself slowly, cautiously, letting it in. He would sit with Silas on his porch in the evenings, the two of them smoking their pipes in a comfortable silence, watching the stars prick the vast, dark sky. He learned the names of the children, the worries of the ranchers, the hopes of the farmers. He learned the rhythm of the valley. And through it all, there was Sayali. Their relationship remained one of quiet, unspoken understanding. The frantic intimacy of the trail and the forced proximity of the sick room had given way to a new, more tentative connection. She was no longer his nurse. She and Emmy had been given their own small cabin, a place of their own within the community. But she still sought him out each day. She would bring him a cup of hot coffee in the morning, or sit with him on the porch in the afternoon, the two of them watching the clouds drift over the high peaks. They spoke little of their shared ordeal. The memory was too raw, a sleeping beast best left undisturbed. Instead, they spoke of other things. He told her stories of his youth back in Missouri, of the farm he had left behind. She told him of her own childhood, of the legends of her people, of the way the seasons painted the mountains she called home. In her, he found a stillness that soothed the restless parts of his own soul. In him, she seemed to find a rock, a place of steadfastness in a world that had tried to sweep her away. He did not know if it was love or gratitude, or simply the profound bond of two survivors, and he did not feel the need to name it. It was enough that it existed. One afternoon, Jed walked, slowly and without his crutch, to the wide pasture at the edge of the settlement. There, its gray coat shimmering in the low afternoon sun, was the horse. It lifted its head as he approached, its dark, intelligent eyes watching him. It did not shy away as he reached the fence, but allowed him to run a hand along its powerful neck. The gelding was a living, breathing symbol of the journey that had brought him here. It had been the bait, the prize, the burden, and the vessel. He had once looked at it with resentment, seeing it as the instrument of the trap that had been sprung on him. Now, he felt only a quiet sense of wonder. This magnificent animal, bought for the last $12 to his name, had been the key that unlocked a life he never knew he was looking for. He stood there for a long time, just breathing the clean, cold air, his hand resting on the horse's warm neck. He felt a sense of peace that was so profound, so complete. It was almost unnerving. He was not thinking of the trail ahead, of the next town, of moving on. For the first time he could remember, he was simply here, and it felt right. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Sayali found him sitting on a log overlooking the valley. She sat down beside him, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the evening chill. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the colors deepen and fade. Finally, she turned to him, her face soft in the twilight glow. Her dark eyes searched his, holding a question that seemed to have been waiting for weeks to be asked. "Do you regret it, Jed?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper above the sound of the wind. He did not have to ask what she meant. He knew. Do you regret the $12? Do you regret the fight, the wounds, the scars? Do you regret that your path, by a cruel twist of fate, became tangled with ours? He looked at her, at the quiet strength and profound compassion in her face. He looked out at the valley, at the small, warm lights that were beginning to glow in the windows of the cabins, each one a small beacon of community, of home. He thought of Emmy's laughter, of Silas's quiet friendship, of the simple, profound feeling of belonging that had settled in his bones. He thought of the man he had been, a ghost, a drifter, a man running from a past he couldn't name and toward a future he didn't want. And he thought of the man he was now, sitting here on this log, his body broken but his spirit, for the first time, whole. He turned his gaze from her face to the far horizon, where the last sliver of the sun was disappearing. leaving the world in a state of beautiful, peaceful twilight. $12, he said, his voice low and raspy, full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. That was the price of the horse. But the price of finding myself is something no money can buy. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and consider hitting the hype button to help this tale reach more listeners like you.